When I walked into the courtroom, my daughter smirked, and my son-in-law just shook his head with open contempt. I was wearing my simple country clothes, worn-out boots, and held an old hat in my hands. I looked like a lost farmer, a confused old man who did not understand where he was. I saw Victoria whisper something to Preston, and he smiled with that arrogance that had always defined him. I heard her choked laugh, a sound that cut through my chest like a knife. To them, I was an embarrassment, an inconvenience, a silly old fool who had no business being there. But then the judge looked up. His eyes met mine. I watched as the color drained from his face as his hand trembled on the wooden gavel. His lips moved and he whispered something that silenced the entire courtroom. "My God," he said, "is it really him?" Everyone turned to look at me. The silence became so thick I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. Victoria stopped smiling. Preston frowned, confused, staring at the judge as if he had lost his mind. They had no idea who I truly was. Not until that moment. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a retired man living a quiet life, I thought I had escaped the deceit of the world, but maintained a close bond with my only child. If you are connecting with my story, please hit the like button to bring a little sunshine to this father's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next life stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me really happy to know which corner of the country or the world is listening to me. It all started 3 months ago on what was supposed to be a peaceful Thursday afternoon at my secluded farm just outside of Richmond, Virginia. Since my beautiful wife Diane passed away 2 years ago, this farm had been my entire world. It was a quiet sanctuary away from the noise of the city, a place where I could tend to my garden, feed the chickens, and sit on the porch, remembering the good decades Diane and I had shared. I had gladly handed over the complex financial chores to my son-in-law, Preston. He was a sharp, fast-talking venture capitalist who married my daughter Victoria 10 years ago. I trusted them. They were my blood, my family. That afternoon, I walked down the long dirt driveway to check the mailbox. Among the grocery store flyers and seed catalogs, there was a thick envelope with a bright red, urgent stamp on the front. It was from the county tax assessor. I tore it open, expecting it to be a routine receipt. Instead, the bold black letters at the top of the page made the breath catch in my throat. Final notice of default. Property tax delinquency. Imminent foreclosure warning. I stood there in the driveway, the autumn wind suddenly feeling like ice against my skin. I read the document 3 times. It stated that my property taxes were 90 days past due, and if the balance was not settled by the end of the month, the county would begin proceedings to seize the farm. My farm. The home where Diane and I had planned to spend our final days. This made absolutely no sense. Exactly 1 month prior, I had transferred $35,000 directly into Preston's account, specifically to cover these property taxes. He had assured me over a family dinner that everything was taken care of, that I should not stress my retired mind with paperwork and wire transfers. I immediately pulled out my phone and dialed Victoria's number. My hands were shaking, not from age, but from a sudden sharp spike of adrenaline. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice carrying the background noise of a busy upscale restaurant. "Hello, Dad. I'm in the middle of a lunch meeting. Can I call you back?" "Victoria, I need to know why I just received a foreclosure warning from the county tax assessor," I said, keeping my voice as level as possible. "I gave Preston the money for the taxes 4 weeks ago. What is going on?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The background noise seemed to muffle. "Dad, calm down," she said, her tone dripping with that patronizing sweetness you use to soothe a panicked child. "Preston handled that. You probably just got a delayed automated letter. Do not worry about it. We will come over tonight and sort it out. Just rest." They arrived at the farm just after sunset. The headlights of Preston's sleek black luxury sedan swept across the front porch where I was waiting. Preston stepped out first wearing an expensive tailored suit, looking entirely unbothered. Victoria followed, clutching a designer handbag, her face set in an expression of exhausted patience. I invited them into the living room and placed the final default notice on the coffee table. "Explain this to me, Preston," I said, pointing at the bold red ink. Preston did not even pick up the paper. He simply sighed, unbuttoned his suit jacket, and sat back on my sofa with an arrogant ease. "Harrison, you are getting worked up over nothing," he said smoothly. "I paid the taxes weeks ago. The county administration is notoriously slow at updating their mailing lists. You know how these government bureaucracies operate. But this letter was printed 3 days ago," I countered, tapping the date at the top of the page. "It explicitly says no payment has been received. If you paid it, show me the bank confirmation receipt right now." Preston exchanged a quick, exasperated look with Victoria. It was a look that screamed, "Here we go again with the crazy old man." "Dad, stop interrogating him," Victoria snapped, stepping forward and placing a perfectly manicured hand on Preston's shoulder. "He is doing you a favor by managing your accounts. You have been forgetting everything lately. You are confused." "I am not confused, Victoria. I am reading a legal document." "You are confused, Dad," she insisted, raising her voice just enough to dominate the room. Her eyes locked onto mine, unyielding and cold. "Do you not realize how bad your memory has gotten? Last week you forgot the name of my new dog. 2 days ago you called me asking what day it was. And yesterday—" She paused, letting out a dramatic, trembling breath. "Yesterday we stopped by while you were napping, and the gas stove was left on. The whole kitchen smelled like a leak. You could have blown up the entire house and died, Dad. We had to turn it off and open all the windows." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I stared at my daughter, feeling the ground beneath my boots turn to ash. The gas stove. For a fraction of a second, my mind played tricks on me. I imagined the smell of gas. I remembered the warmth of that kitchen. Diane used to stand at that exact stove humming to old jazz records while she simmered her famous Sunday pot roasts. The aroma of garlic and rosemary used to fill these walls, making this empty house feel like a home. But when Diane lost her battle with sickness 2 years ago, the music stopped. The cooking stopped. I looked toward the kitchen archway. I had not turned on that gas stove in exactly 2 years. I lived exclusively on cold sandwiches, microwave meals, and coffee from an electric maker. I had even shut off the main gas valve behind the appliance months ago because I had no use for it. It was physically impossible for me to have left the stove on yesterday. A terrifying, icy realization washed over me. I was not losing my mind. My daughter was deliberately lying to my face. Why? Why would she make up a story about me almost blowing up the house? Why would Preston look so completely calm about a missing $35,000? I looked at their faces again. Victoria was performing the role of a highly concerned, stressed-out daughter flawlessly. Preston was playing the patient, misunderstood son-in-law. If I were just a regular, grieving old farmer, I would have broken down right then and there. I would have apologized for my declining memory. I would have surrendered my independence to them. But they had forgotten one crucial detail about my past. Before I moved to this farm, before I became the quiet old man who tended to chickens, I spent 30 years as a federal prosecutor. I had stared into the eyes of the most ruthless, manipulative white-collar criminals in the country. I knew exactly what a lie looked like. I knew the subtle micro-expressions of a sociopath cornered in a lie. I was seeing those exact same expressions right now on the faces of my own family. My gut screamed at me to throw them out, to demand my money back, to rip the truth out of them. But my old prosecutor instincts kicked in cold and calculating. If I confronted them now without solid proof, they would escalate their narrative. They would use my anger as further proof of my supposed mental instability. To win this war, I had to play their game. I had to let them believe they had won the battle. I let my shoulders slump. I forced my hands to shake a little more visibly. I looked down at the floor, imitating the posture of a defeated, confused senior citizen. I left the stove on, murmured, letting my voice crack with manufactured vulnerability. Yes, Dad, Victoria said, her voice instantly softening into that fake, sugary tone. It terrified us. You are getting older. The grief is catching up to you. You cannot handle all this stress anymore. I slowly nodded, keeping my eyes averted so she could not see the absolute rage burning behind them. You might be right, I whispered. I am just so tired. Preston stood up, buttoning his jacket with a satisfied smirk. Do not worry about the tax notice, Harrison. I will call the county assessor on Monday and clear up their clerical error. You just focus on resting. We will take care of everything. As they walked out the front door, leaving me alone in the quiet farmhouse, I stood by the window and watched their luxury car disappear down the dark road. My sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. They thought I was a clueless old man waiting to die. They thought they could steal my money and gaslight me into an asylum. But they had just woken up a sleeping lion. The hunt had officially begun. The morning after their visit, Victoria showed up at the farm before the sun had crested the horizon. She walked into my kitchen holding a small, unmarked amber prescription bottle. She set it on the granite counter next to my coffee maker, with a soft, patronizing smile. Dad, I spoke with Dr. Aris this morning, she said, pouring me a cup of coffee. He agrees with Preston and me. The grief, the isolation is taking a toll on your cognitive functions. He prescribed these vitamins to help support your memory and keep you sharp. I stared at the little amber bottle. It looked innocent enough. Just a plastic cylinder filled with small white capsules. But a voice in the back of my head, a very old, very cynical voice that had interrogated mob bosses and embezzlers, whispered to me, "Do not take them." I knew I should listen to that sharp instinct. It had kept me alive in courtrooms for decades without fail. But she was my daughter. She was the little girl I had taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager I had proudly sent off to college, the woman I had walked to marry Preston. How could I let my paranoid prosecutor brain accuse my own flesh and blood of foul play over a forgotten gas stove? I convinced myself that the stress of the foreclosure notice was making me jumpy. I needed to trust my family. So I unscrewed the cap, took out a pill, and swallowed it with my coffee. Victoria beamed, kissing me on the cheek before grabbing her coat and leaving for the city. She told me she would text me every morning to make sure I took my medicine. And for the sake of family peace, I did exactly what I was told. Within exactly 2 long weeks, my entire physical reality began to warp into a nightmare. It started as a subtle heaviness behind my eyes, a dark, persistent, muddy fog that seemed to settle heavily over my brain by mid-morning. I used to wake up easily at 5 daily to tend to the vegetable garden and read the financial papers. By the end of the first week on the pills, I was struggling to drag myself out of bed before 10. My legs felt like they were filled with wet sand. Every step took an effort. I would sit on the edge of the mattress, gasping for air like a drowning man. Then came the tremors. I noticed it first while trying to sign a delivery receipt for some chicken feed. My hand shook so violently that the pen slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the porch. The delivery driver looked at me with a sense of deep, uncomfortable pity. It was the kind of look you give a dying animal. It made my stomach turn. By the second week, the mental fog had thickened into a solid wall. Thoughts would form in my head, sharp and clear, only to dissolve into white noise before I could articulate them. I found myself staring at the living room wall for hours, unable to remember what I was supposed to be doing. The brilliant legal mind that had spent decades outsmarting the most devious criminals in the country was being reduced to mush. I felt like a prisoner trapped inside a failing body. Every memory of Diane, every detail of our life together felt painfully distant and utterly unreachable. But despite the lethargy dragging me down, a singular thought kept piercing through the fog. The tax default notice. Preston had promised he would call the county and fix the error. He had sworn my $35,000 was exactly where it needed to be. But the paranoia had taken root. I needed to know for certain. I needed to look at my bank statements and trace the wire transfer myself. One afternoon, while the farmhouse was quiet, I sat down at the kitchen table and pulled my laptop toward me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, shaking uncontrollably. I tried to type in the web address for my bank, but my blurry vision made the letters swim on the screen. It took me 3 attempts just to get to the login portal. The bright screen glared back at me, mocking my sudden incompetence. I wiped the sweat from my brow. I clicked on the username field. I typed it in. Then I moved to the password box. I stared at the blinking cursor. My mind went blank. I closed my eyes, rubbing my temples, trying to force my brain to work. I had used the same password for this account for 5 years. It was a combination of Diane's maiden name and our anniversary year, a simple sequence that was burned into my memory. But when I reached into the filing cabinet of my mind to retrieve it, the drawer was empty. There was nothing there. Just a cloud of white noise. Panic began to bubble in my chest. My breathing turned shallow and rapid. I typed in what I thought was the password. Incorrect. I tried a variation. Perhaps I had capitalized the wrong letter. Incorrect. My hands were trembling so badly that I was hitting the wrong keys. I hit the enter button a 3rd time. A red warning box flashed on the screen. Your account has been temporarily locked due to multiple failed login attempts. Please contact customer service. I shoved the laptop away, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed my cell phone from the table, my trembling thumbs fumbling over the screen to dial the bank's customer service line. The voice prompted me to enter my account number. I pulled my debit card from my wallet and typed the 16 digits. Then came the prompt. Please enter your 4-digit telephone security PIN to speak with a representative. I froze. The phone pressed against my ear felt like a block of ice. 4 digits. Just 4 numbers. I knew this PIN. I knew it like I knew my own name. But as I stood there in my kitchen staring at the wall, the numbers refused to materialize. The drugs coursing through my bloodstream had built a dam between me and my own memories. Please enter your 4-digit telephone security PIN, the voice repeated. Come on, Harrison, I muttered, my voice hoarse. Think. Just think. I punched in a sequence. The year I became a federal prosecutor. I waited, holding my breath. I am sorry. That PIN is incorrect. You have 2 attempts remaining. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The room started to spin slightly. The lethargy from the morning pill was pulling me down, begging me to go back to bed and forget about it. But the terror of losing control kept me anchored to the floor. I typed in another set of numbers. Diane's birth month and day. I am sorry, that PIN is incorrect. You have 1 attempt remaining before your account is frozen for your protection. I lowered the phone from my ear. My chest heaved as I struggled to draw in air. I looked down at my shaking hands. They belonged to an old man. They did not look like the hands that had once slammed legal briefs onto mahogany tables demanding justice. They looked weak. I felt weak. I hit the end call button and let the phone drop onto the table. The silence of the farmhouse crashed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I sank into a chair, burying my face in my trembling hands. For the first time since Diane died, I felt completely terrified. I was locked out of my own finances. I had no way to verify if Preston had stolen my $35,000. I had no way to prove that the foreclosure notice was real. And worst of all, I was losing the only weapon I had left to fight back. My own mind. Victoria and Preston had insisted these pills would clear my head. They had looked me in the eye and promised they were helping me. But as I sat there shaking and confused, unable to remember a 4-digit number, a chilling realization sliced through the haze. They were not trying to cure me. They were trying to erase me. The next few days passed in a blur of agonizing clarity mixed with chemical exhaustion. I knew the pills they were giving me were poison. But I also knew that if I suddenly stopped taking them completely, Victoria and Preston would know I had figured out their game. I had to maintain the facade. I continued to take the pills when Victoria was watching, secretly spitting them into my palm and hiding them in my pockets. But enough of the drug was already in my system to keep my hands trembling and my mind wading through thick mud. They visited again on a Sunday morning, bringing an expensive box of pastries from downtown Richmond. Victoria breezed through the front door with her usual counterfeit cheerfulness, loudly asking how her favorite father was doing. Preston trailed behind her, checking his watch, radiating impatient obligation. I was standing by the kitchen counter trying to pour a cup of black coffee. The heavy ceramic mug felt like it weighed 50 pounds. "Here, let me help you with that," Dad, Victoria said, stepping forward with a completely fake look of deep concern plastered across her face. "I can do it," I muttered, trying to sound frail. I grasped the mug and lifted it. My hand began to shake violently. The dark liquid sloshed over the rim, burning my knuckles. I tried to steady my grip, but the tremors were too severe. The mug slipped and crashed onto the hardwood floor, sending a spray of hot coffee and jagged ceramic shards across the room. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Preston sighed heavily. "I am sorry," I whispered, immediately dropping to my knees. I blindly gathered the broken pieces, letting my hands tremble even more than they naturally were. I kept my head down, playing the part of the pathetic, ruined old farmer they desperately wanted me to be. "Do not cut yourself, Dad," Victoria said, her voice laced with fake sympathy. "Just leave it. I will get the mop." She walked toward the utility closet down the hall. I remained on the floor, carefully picking up a sharp piece of ceramic. From my position on the ground, I had a clear view of the large sliding glass door that led out to the back patio. The morning sun was hitting the glass at just the right angle, turning it into a perfect dark mirror. I looked at the reflection in the glass. Preston was standing behind me, leaning against the kitchen island. He was not looking down at me with pity or concern. His face was twisted into a sneer of absolute undisguised disgust. It was a look of cold, calculating impatience. Victoria walked back into the kitchen with the mop. She paused next to her husband, looking down at me as I continued to fumble with the broken pieces on the floor. Preston leaned in close to her ear. His voice was nothing more than a faint hiss, but the kitchen was quiet enough for the sound to carry directly to me. "He is practically useless now," Preston whispered, his eyes fixed on my shaking back. "It will not be long." Victoria did not reprimand him. She did not defend her father. She simply gave a short, silent nod of agreement and handed him a paper towel. As I stared at their reflection, a profound silence settled over my mind. The chemical fog that had been suffocating my brain vanished, burned away by a sudden flash of absolute rage. The trembling in my hands stopped entirely. I knelt there on the floor, clutching the broken ceramic, and let the sheer audacity of his words sink into my bones. He is practically useless now. In that fraction of a second, the image of the weak widower shattered completely. That specific look of arrogant contempt on Preston's face flipped a deeply buried switch in my brain. It was the exact same expression I used to see on arrogant Wall Street fraudsters right before I destroyed their lives 30 years ago. I remembered sitting across polished tables from men just like Preston. Men who believed their slick words made them untouchable. They thought they could manipulate the system, steal from the innocent, and walk away clean. They always smiled until the moment I dropped irrefutable evidence of their crimes in front of a judge and watched the color drain from their faces. For 30 years, I was the apex predator in those courtrooms. I built cases so airtight that defense attorneys advised clients to plead guilty rather than face me. When Diane died, I packed away that part of myself. I traded tailored suits for flannel shirts and legal briefs for garden tools. I wanted peace. I wanted to rest. But seeing Preston standing in my kitchen plotting my demise with my daughter, I realized my retirement had been a mistake. I was not a sick old man. I was a target hunted by amateurs. They thought they had found a vulnerable victim with a thick bank account and a fading memory. They thought they could drug me into compliance, steal my property, and throw me into a cheap nursing home to rot. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy focus of my past career wash over me. The prosecutor inside me was fully awake and he was hungry. I knew exactly what I had to do. I could not confront them yet. I needed evidence. I needed a paper trail. I needed to build a prosecution case so devastating that neither of them would ever recover. I let out a ragged, pathetic sigh and allowed my hands to start shaking again. I dropped the piece of ceramic and slowly pushed myself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the counter for support. "I am so sorry." "Victoria," I stammered, making my voice tremble perfectly. "I just cannot seem to hold on to anything today. My hands simply will not cooperate." Victoria patted my arm, her fake smile firmly back in place. "It is okay, Dad. That is why we are here to take care of you. You just go sit down in your recliner and rest. I will clean up this mess." I nodded meekly and shuffled slowly toward the living room, dragging my feet exactly the way a heavily medicated man would. I slumped into my old leather armchair, closing my eyes as if I were exhausted by the simple effort of walking. In reality, my mind was racing at 1,000 miles an hour. Every detail of the room, every word they had spoken, every financial transaction I could remember was being categorized and filed away for future use. I listened to the sound of Victoria mopping the kitchen floor and Preston typing away on his expensive smartphone. They felt secure in their deception. They genuinely believed the hardest part of their plan was over. They had no idea that the real game had just begun. The battle lines were drawn in the spilled coffee on my kitchen floor, and I was going to ensure that when the dust settled, I would be the only one left standing. The next morning, the routine played out exactly as it had for the past 2 weeks. Victoria called at 8 to ensure I was awake and to remind me to take my medicine. I kept my voice weak and raspy, assuring her I had the bottle right in my hand. I unscrewed the cap, took out one of the small white capsules, and walked into the bathroom. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, and my skin held a sickly, pale hue. I tossed the pill into the toilet and flushed it away. I watched the swirling water carry it out of sight, and with it went the last shred of blind trust I held for my daughter. Over the next 48 hours, I repeated this performance. Every morning and every evening, a pill went down the drain. The withdrawal was brutal. My body ached with deep muscle cramps and relentless headaches pounded behind my temples as the chemical sludge filtered out of my system. But by the morning of the 3rd day, the heavy curtain lifted. My thoughts snapped back into sharp focus. The lingering cognitive fog vanished, and the calculating mind of a federal prosecutor returned in full force. My hands were steady as I poured my black coffee. I was back. But Victoria and Preston could not know that. Whenever they visited or called, I maintained the facade, letting my hands tremble and allowing my words to trail off into whispers. I needed proof of what was hidden inside those capsules. I knew better than to visit my regular physician in Richmond. Victoria was listed as my emergency contact and possessed medical proxy rights on my file. Any toxicology test requested locally would generate a notification and trigger an alert to her smartphone. I had to go off the grid. I bypassed my sedan equipped with GPS tracking and walked to the barn. Under a tarp was my farm truck from the 90s. I grabbed the keys, tossed the amber pill bottle onto the passenger seat, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life with a loud mechanical grumble. I drove 50 miles, taking unpaved back roads until I reached a rural clinic nestled between 2 farm towns. The waiting room was empty. I walked up to the front reception desk and paid $300 in cash for a confidential consultation. I used a variation of my middle name to register. The attending doctor was a tired-looking man with gray hair who seemed surprised to have an elderly walk-in patient ask for toxicology testing. I sat down on the examination table and handed him the small white capsule along with a $50 bill to guarantee an expedited process. I told him I needed to know what chemical compounds were inside that pill and I required a blood panel to determine what toxins were circulating through my veins. He frowned, turning the capsule over in his gloved hands, but the cash payment and my tone left him no room for argument. He assured me I would have the results by the following afternoon. I thanked him, walked back out to my truck, and began the drive home. The adrenaline rushing from the secret mission kept my mind racing. I was calculating my next legal moves, plotting how to dismantle Preston's financial web. As I navigated the country roads, my mind turned over the reality of my situation. I had dedicated my professional career to putting criminals behind bars. I had spent decades analyzing financial fraud, evaluating testimonies, and protecting vulnerable citizens from the type of predatory behavior my family was executing. The audacity of their plan was staggering. They believed that because I was a grieving widower, I had forgotten how to fight. They assumed my age made me defenseless. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling a sense of clarity wash over me. I was not just going to stop them. I was going to dismantle their operation, leaving them with nothing. Lost in my planning, I did not realize how much time had passed. I glanced down at the dashboard clock. It was almost noon. Victoria always called the kitchen landline at noon on her lunch break to monitor my condition. If I did not answer the phone, she would panic. If she panicked, she would send Preston to the farm to investigate. They would realize I was lucid, capable, and operating an investigation right behind their backs. I slammed my boot down onto the gas pedal. The truck rattled as I pushed it past the speed limit, tearing down the rural highways. Pine trees blurred past my windows. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. I calculated the remaining distance and the time. It was going to be close. I swerved onto my dirt driveway, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. Before I even brought the truck to a stop behind the barn, I could hear it. The ringing of the landline phone echoing from the kitchen window. I killed the engine, threw open the door, and sprinted across the yard. The phone rang again. It was on its fifth ring. One more ring and she would hang up and assume the worst. I tore open the screen door, lunged across the kitchen floor, and snatched the receiver off the wall mount just as the sixth ring began. I held the phone to my chest for 1 second. I forced my heart to calm down. I let out a breath and brought the receiver to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice trembling and raspy. "Dad," Victoria's voice barked through the speaker. "I was about to call Preston and have him drive out there. Is everything all right?" "I am sorry, sweetheart," I mumbled, forcing a chuckle. I was out on the porch. It took me a minute to remember where the ringing was coming from. "My legs are so heavy today. I think the medicine is making me sleepy." She let out a sigh. The tension in her voice vanished, replaced once again by that artificial sweetness. "Oh, Dad. You need to be careful. Do not push yourself. The vitamins are doing their job, helping your brain heal. Did you take your morning dose?" I looked at the empty amber bottle resting in my pocket. "Yes, Victoria," I whispered, staring at the kitchen wall. "I took it exactly like you told me to. I am following all your instructions." "Good," she replied. "Preston and I will come by this weekend to check on things. Just stay in the house, Dad. We will handle everything from here." I hung up the phone slowly and let the false facade drop completely. I stood tall in the very center of the quiet kitchen, my breathing steadying my old mind sharp and clear. The trap was set, and the greedy hunters had no idea they were walking into a cage. The telephone rang just past 2 in the afternoon the next day. I let it chime 3 times before picking up the receiver, ensuring my breathing was calm and measured. It was the doctor from the rural clinic, exactly as promised. He did not bother with pleasantries. His voice was tight, carrying a weight of deep professional concern that immediately set my nerves on edge. He asked if I was sitting down. I told him I was standing, but that my mind was perfectly clear and ready for whatever he had to say. He explained that this blood panel and the chemical breakdown of the capsule had yielded highly disturbing results. The pills my daughter had given me were not vitamins. They did not contain a single trace of any dietary supplement. They were a concentrated generic formulation of a potent antipsychotic medication, a drug specifically designed to treat extreme cases of acute schizophrenia and violent psychotic episodes. The dosage in those capsules was dangerously high, especially for a man of my age. The doctor explained that introducing such heavy neuroleptics into a healthy brain would rapidly mimic the late stages of severe dementia. It forces the nervous system to shut down. It creates artificial tremors, profound confusion, memory blockages, and an overwhelming lethargy that essentially traps the patient inside their own failing body. He warned me that prolonged exposure could cause irreversible neurological damage or induce a fatal cardiac event. He urged me to contact the authorities immediately, offering to forward his lab results to the local police precinct. I thanked him for his diligence, politely declined his offer to involve the police just yet, and asked him to mail a physical copy of the certified lab report to a private post office box I maintained under a different name. I hung up the phone. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. My own daughter, my own flesh and blood had systematically poisoned me. She had smiled in my face, kissed my cheek, and handed me the very chemical chains meant to drag me into a padded cell. The betrayal was so absolute, so profoundly evil, that it transcended anger. It solidified into a cold, unbreakable sheet of pure tactical resolve. I knew Victoria was busy with a corporate media launch that afternoon, which meant Preston would be the one assigned to execute the daily welfare check. He arrived at the farm just before 5 o'clock. The gravel crunched under the heavy tires of his luxury sedan. I watched him from the kitchen window. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his expensive Italian wool coat, looking around my property with the calculating eyes of a real estate developer surveying a vacant lot. He walked up the porch steps, not bothering to knock, and let himself in using the spare key I had foolishly given them years ago. I quickly shuffled into the living room, slumping my shoulders, and allowing a pronounced tremor to take over my hands. I stared blankly at the unlit fireplace, mouth slightly open, performing the role of the heavily sedated father to perfection. Preston walked into the room, stopping a few feet away from my chair. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not offer a warm greeting. He simply stood there, pulling a sleek leather notebook from his breast pocket and jotting something down. "Harrison," he said, his voice loud and condescending. "Did you take your afternoon dose?" Victoria said. "You sounded a bit out of sorts on the phone yesterday. We need to make sure you are staying on top of your regimen." I slowly turned my head toward him, blinking several times as if trying to focus my vision. "Yes," I murmured, letting my voice crack. "I took them. But my head feels so heavy today, Preston. Everything is spinning." He let out a short, dismissive sigh, clearly annoyed by my existence. "Well, the doctor said it takes time for your brain chemistry to balance out. You just need to sit quietly and let the medication do its work." As he spoke, he reached into the right pocket of his wool coat to retrieve his ringing cell phone. When he pulled the phone out, the fabric of the pocket pulled back just enough for me to catch a glimpse of something metallic reflecting the afternoon light. It was a small, uniquely shaped brass key attached to a heavy silver ring. I recognized it instantly. It was the master key to the heavy floor safe hidden behind the false paneling in my study. A month ago, when I first noticed the key missing from my nightstand, Victoria had spent an hour helping me search the house. She had held my hands, looked me in the eye, and gently told me that my memory was failing, that I must have misplaced it during one of my confused episodes. She had used my own missing property as the first brick in her foundation of gaslighting. And all along that key had been resting comfortably in her husband's pocket. I needed that key. If they were accessing my safe, they were accessing the original deeds, the bearer bonds, and the legal structures of my entire estate. I knew I had to get it back right then and there, but I could not simply demand it. If I confronted him, he would know the dementia was a ruse. I had to steal it. During the late 80s, I spearheaded a massive federal takedown of a vast organized crime syndicate operating out of the eastern seaboard. To build my case, I had relied heavily on a street-level informant named Jimmy, a master pickpocket, who had turned state evidence. During our many long hours in the safe house, Jimmy had taught me the mechanics of the dip. He explained that successful theft was not about speed, but about misdirection. You had to create a physical shock, a sudden overwhelming point of contact that overloaded the target's sensory perception, making them completely blind to the subtle movement of your hands. I never in my wildest dreams imagined I would employ a mobster's street trick against my own son-in-law in my own living room. I gripped the armrests of my chair and began to push myself up. I made my legs shake violently. "Preston." "I need water," I gasped. He rolled his eyes and took a step toward me. "Just sit down, Harrison. I will get it from the kitchen." As he reached out to push me back into the chair, I executed the maneuver. I allowed my eyes to roll back into my head. I let all the tension drain from my knees, completely simulating a sudden massive fainting spell. My dead weight collapsed forward directly into Preston. He grunted in surprise, dropping his phone on the carpet, as he instinctively threw both of his arms around my torso to catch me. His hands gripped my shoulders tight, his entire focus consumed by the sudden physical burden of my collapsing body. He was completely overloaded by the shock of the moment. In that exact second, while his attention was entirely focused on keeping us both from crashing to the floor, my right hand slipped smoothly and silently into the open pocket of his wool coat. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of the brass key. I pinched it between my index and middle finger, sliding it out with a fluid, practiced motion. I immediately tucked the key into the waistband of my trousers, pulling my sweater down to conceal it. The entire extraction took less than 2 seconds. "What is wrong with you?" he snapped, struggling to push my heavy frame back into the leather armchair. "Stand up, Harrison. Come on, sit back down." I let him maneuver me back into the seat. I slumped against the cushions, letting out a long, ragged breath, blinking wildly, as if I had just regained consciousness. "I am sorry," I whispered weakly. The room just went completely black. I felt so dizzy. Preston dusted off his expensive coat with a look of utter revulsion. He bent down to retrieve his fallen phone, completely unaware that his pocket was now lighter. "This is exactly why you cannot be left alone anymore," he muttered, typing a rapid message on his screen. "You are becoming a massive liability. I will get you a glass of tap water, and then I have to leave. I have a business meeting." He turned his back on me and marched toward the kitchen. The moment he was out of sight, I reached into my waistband and pulled out the brass key. The metal felt heavy and cold against my palm. I gripped it tightly, feeling the sharp edges press into my skin. It was not just a piece of metal. It was the key to my survival. It was the proof that they were already inside my vault, dismantling my life from the inside out. Preston returned, shoving a glass of water onto the side table. "Drink that and stay in this chair," he ordered. "Victoria will call you tonight." I nodded slowly, keeping my hands folded in my lap, hiding the stolen key. "Thank you, Preston," I murmured. "You are a good son." He sneered, turned on his heel, and walked out the front door. I listened to his luxury car start up and crunch its way down the driveway. I did not move until the sound of the engine completely faded into the distance. Then I sat up straight. The tremors vanished. The weakness evaporated. I looked down at the brass key resting in my palm. The rage that had been simmering in my chest crystallized into pure, unadulterated purpose. They had poisoned my body. They had insulted my intelligence. Now they were robbing my vault. The time for hiding was over. It was time to strike back. Every piece of evidence I gathered from now on would be a nail in their proverbial coffins. I was not going to simply survive this attack against my life. I was going to utterly dismantle their fraudulent reality just as cruelly as they had tried to erase mine. I waited until the sun dipped below the tree line and the farm was wrapped in total darkness. I knew better than to use the landline or my cell phone. If Preston and Victoria were bold enough to drug me and steal the key to my safe, they were certainly capable of monitoring my call logs. During my afternoon trip to the rural clinic, I had purchased a cheap, prepaid cellular phone with a handful of cash. I pulled the small plastic device from my boot, powered it on, and dialed a number I had memorized over 20 years ago. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. It was Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was a titan in the world of civil law, a man who navigated courtrooms with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a shark. We had fought on opposite sides of the aisle many times during my days as a federal prosecutor. Over the years, that professional rivalry had melted into a profound, unspoken respect. He was the only person I could trust with a secret of this magnitude. "Jonathan," I said, keeping my voice low. "It is Harrison Caldwell. I am using an unregistered phone. Do not return a call to my primary number." There was a brief pause on the line. Harrison Jonathan replied, his tone immediately shifting from casual to strictly business. "You do not buy burner phones to chat about the weather." "What is happening?" I laid out the facts with the clinical detachment of a man presenting an indictment. I told him about the property tax default notice. I told him about the antipsychotic drugs my own daughter had disguised as vitamins. I told him about Preston stealing the key to my hidden floor safe. I did not offer emotional commentary. I simply gave him the evidence. I reminded him that if this failed, I would lose everything I had built for my family, my land, and my freedom. He promised me he would move heaven and earth to prevent that. Jonathan remained silent for a long moment after I finished. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet, terrifying anger. "They are setting you up for a fraudulent conservatorship, Harrison. They are trying to medically establish your incompetence so they can seize your assets. We need to document their actions immediately. I need eyes inside my own house," I told him. "I need them to catch Preston opening that safe. But it has to be completely off the books. No official security companies. No paper trails they can find." "I have a private technical team," Jonathan assured me. "Former federal surveillance experts who work exclusively for my firm. They are discreet and they are fast. I will send them to your farm tonight. Leave the back door unlocked." The hours before midnight crawled by with agonizing slowness. I sat in the dark living room watching the faint moonlight filter through the curtains. I ran through every possible legal scenario in my head. I was no longer a father trying to understand his child. I was an investigator building a trap. Precisely at midnight, 2 unmarked dark sedans rolled silently up my dirt driveway. The headlights were extinguished. 3 men dressed in dark, nondescript clothing slipped out of the vehicles and moved swiftly toward my back porch. They wore gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints and carried specialized gear bags that looked completely ordinary from the outside. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and let them inside. They did not ask questions. They offered no pleasantries. They simply went to work with a level of quiet professionalism that instantly put me at ease. The lead technician, a tall man with sharp eyes, handed me a secure tablet. He explained that they would be installing military-grade micro-cameras directly into the architectural molding of the living room and the study. The lenses were no larger than the head of a pin, completely invisible to the naked eye. The video feeds would be encrypted and uploaded directly to a secure server at Jonathan's law firm. If Preston or Victoria stepped foot in this house, every movement, every whisper would be captured and preserved as irrefutable legal evidence. I directed them to the study first. I pointed to the heavy oak bookshelves lining the far wall. The floor safe was hidden beneath a false section of hardwood, directly below the bottom shelf. The technicians nodded and began drilling microscopic holes into the crown molding near the ceiling. They worked with surgical precision, routing tiny wires behind the drywall. I watched them in the dim light of a desk lamp, feeling a strange mix of relief and profound sorrow. I was turning my own sanctuary into an active surveillance zone to catch my daughter committing a felony. The reality of that fact weighed heavily on my chest, but I pushed the emotion aside. This was a war of survival. Every second ticked loudly in my ears, reminding me that we were operating in a highly vulnerable window of time. If Preston had decided to return for another surprise check, the entire operation would be exposed instantly. The installation process, however, proved to be far more complicated than anticipated. The thick, century-old plaster and dense oak beams of my farmhouse resisted their modern tools. What was supposed to be a rapid 45-minute operation stretched into 90 minutes. They had successfully wired the study and were moving out into the main living room to establish a secondary camera angle. The lead technician signaled that they needed another 30 minutes to conceal the power transmitter behind the fireplace mantel. I stood watch by the front window, keeping my eyes fixed on the long, dark stretch of road leading up to my property. It was exactly 1:45 in the morning when the silent alarm triggered. A small blue light flashed on the digital monitor I kept next to the front door. The monitor was connected to a motion sensor I had installed at the very entrance of my driveway years ago to track delivery trucks. Someone had just turned onto my property. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. My breathing quickened as the reality of the situation washed over me. The entire operation was hanging by a delicate, microscopic thread. The tech team was actively pulling wiring across the center of the living room floor. The heavy mantelpiece was partially detached from the wall. There were tools scattered across the rug. I pressed a button on the monitor to pull up the live feed from the gate camera. A sleek black luxury SUV was creeping up the driveway, moving slowly so the gravel would not make too much noise. The license plate was unmistakable. It was Victoria. She was coming to check on me. My mind raced to analyze her motivation. Why would she drive all the way out here at nearly 2 in the morning? The answer hit me like a physical blow. The evening dose. I had flushed my nighttime pill down the toilet hours ago, but I had not texted her to confirm I had taken it. I had been so focused on coordinating with Jonathan and the surveillance team that I had neglected to maintain the illusion of compliance. Victoria, obsessed with keeping my system flooded with those antipsychotic drugs, had driven out here in the dead of night to force the pill down my throat herself. I knew she was ruthless, but driving out to the farm at 2 in the morning proved how deeply she was committed to this dark scheme. The stakes were absolute life and death now. I spun around to face the technicians. "We have a vehicle approaching," I whispered sharply, my voice carrying across the silent room. "You have exactly 2 minutes before she is at the front door." The 3 men moved instantly. They began rolling up the exposed wires and shoving their equipment into their black duffel bags. But the living room was a mess. The thick white plaster dust from the heavy drilling was glaringly visible on the dark polished hardwood floor. The mantelpiece was still slightly misaligned. There was absolutely no way they could pack their gear, clean the evidence, and exit the house without Victoria noticing the disruption. The bright headlights of her SUV swept across the front windows, casting long, terrifying shadows across the living room walls. I could hear the crunch of the tires as she pulled the vehicle to a stop right behind the unmarked sedans belonging to the tech team. She would see those cars. She would see the dust. She would realize the trap was being set, and the entire prosecution would crumble before I could even file a single document. I needed to buy them time. I needed to create a distraction so monumental and so disturbing that she would forget about the strange cars, forget about the dust on the floor, and focus entirely on me. I looked at the lead technician. "Go out the back window," I ordered quietly. "Do not stop moving until you reach the tree line. I will handle her and buy you the minutes you need." The heavy slam of a car door echoed through the cold night air. The sound of her expensive heels began to click rhythmically against the stone walkway leading up to the porch. I had 10 seconds left. I had to become the broken, helpless old man she believed she had created, and I had to do it right outside before she could ever turn the knob of my front door. I threw open the heavy oak front door and stepped out onto the porch. The freezing night air hit my bare skin like a physical blow. I was wearing nothing but thin cotton pajamas, and the temperature had plummeted well below freezing. The shock of the cold was immediate and severe, but I welcomed it. It made my physical reaction genuine. I began to shiver violently, my teeth chattering, as I stumbled down the wooden steps and onto the frozen gravel of the driveway. I wrapped my arms around my chest, hunching my shoulders, and began to wander aimlessly toward the blinding headlights of her luxury vehicle. I widened my eyes, forcing a look of absolute hollow terror onto my face. I let my jaw go slack. I needed to look like a man whose mind had completely detached from reality. I had to become a man, wandering blindly through a shattered memory, terrified of the shadows lost in his own home. Victoria killed the engine and slammed her door shut. I heard the sharp crunch of her designer boots on the gravel as she marched toward me. Even in the darkness, I could see the fury radiating from her posture. "What on earth are you doing out here, Harrison?" she snapped, not even bothering to use the word Dad. Her voice was sharp, laced with cold irritation, rather than parental concern. "Get back inside this instant. Are you trying to catch pneumonia?" I did not look directly at her. Instead, I stared past her shoulder into the dark woods, raising a trembling hand to point at nothing. "Diane," I wailed, letting my voice crack with pathetic desperation. "Diane, is that you? Where have you been? I have been looking everywhere. I cannot find the keys, Diane. The house is so cold." Victoria stopped dead in her tracks. The sheer volume of my apparent delusion caught her completely off guard. She stared at me, shivering in the frost, barefoot on the jagged stones, crying out for a woman who had been buried for years. I stumbled forward, reaching out into the empty air, grasping at ghosts. I could practically see the gears turning behind her eyes. The irritation morphed into a twisted, victorious satisfaction. She truly believed her toxic pills had finally pushed me over the edge into full-blown dementia. She stepped forward and grabbed me by the bicep. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingernails digging through the thin fabric of my pajamas. "Stop this nonsense," she commanded, pulling me toward the porch. "Diane is dead. You are confused. Move your feet." I resisted. I planted my bare feet firmly in the freezing gravel and let my body go completely limp, forcing her to support my entire weight. "No, no," I pleaded, shaking my head frantically. "I have to wait for her. She said she was coming right back. Do not make me go inside. It is not safe in there. The shadows are moving. I am frightened." I dragged out the struggle, pulling against her, stumbling over the stones, doing everything in my power to keep us outside in the freezing air. Every second I stalled was another second the surveillance team had to secure their gear, wipe away the plaster dust, and vanish into the forest. Victoria groaned in frustration, struggling to hold my heavy frame upright. She dug her heels into the dirt, cursing under her breath. "Get up, you foolish old man," she growled, completely dropping her loving daughter persona. "You are going to ruin everything if you die of exposure out here in the yard." "Stand up." I let my knees buckle again, scraping my shins against the icy driveway. I moaned in fabricated agony, clutching at her expensive cashmere coat like a frightened child seeking refuge. "Please," I sobbed, burying my face against her sleeve. "They are watching me in there. The men in the walls are watching me. I cannot go back inside." The irony of my words was not lost on me, but to Victoria it was just another symptom of profound psychotic paranoia. She yanked her arm away, repulsed by my touch. "You are hallucinating, Harrison. There is no one in the walls. There is no one here but you and me. Now walk." I dragged my feet, forcing her to literally pull me inch by inch up the wooden steps. I counted the seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. I needed to give Jonathan's team absolute certainty. I intentionally tripped over the top step, sprawling hard onto the wooden deck of the porch. I lay there on my stomach, gasping for air, letting the bitter cold seep deep into my bones. Victoria brutally kicked my left leg, a sharp, incredibly cruel motion that spoke undeniable volumes about the true blackness of her heart. I said, "Get up," she hissed, leaning down so her face was inches from mine. "You are not going to ruin my plans tonight. You are going to go inside, you are going to take your medication, and you are going to sleep." I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, whimpering softly. I allowed her to grab the collar of my pajama shirt and hoist me to my feet. We stumbled through the front door and collapsed into the main hallway. The sudden warmth of the house washed over me, but I did not stop shivering. I sank against the wall, pulling my knees to my chest and rocking back and forth. Victoria stood over me, panting heavily from the physical exertion. She smoothed down her expensive coat and glared at me with absolute contempt. She did not immediately look toward the living room. Her attention was entirely focused on managing the pathetic creature cowering at her feet. I risked a quick, subtle glance down the hall. The living room was perfectly dark. The heavy power tools were gone. The backsliding door was shut tight. The thick layer of white plaster dust had been hastily swept away. The tech team had vanished like phantoms in the night. "Stay right there," she ordered, turning on her heel and marching toward the kitchen. "Do not move a single muscle." I listened to her open the glass cabinets, running the cold tap water into a small plastic cup. She returned holding water and a white capsule. "You missed your nighttime dose," she said coldly, crouching down to my level. She shoved the pill against my lips. "Open your mouth and swallow this right now." I whimpered, but obediently opened my mouth. I placed the pill on my tongue, took a large gulp of water, and swallowed hard, making sure she saw my throat move. She watched me closely, waiting a full minute to ensure I had not hidden it. What she did not know was that I had already trapped the capsule inside my cheek. Satisfied, Victoria stood up, gave me a look of disgust, and left. As her car drove away, I spat the pill out. I looked up at the crown molding. A tiny red light blinked once. The cameras were live. The silent hunt for their ultimate destruction had officially begun. The silent hunt for their ultimate destruction had officially begun. The following morning broke with a heavy gray overcast that mirrored the cold determination settling deep into my bones. I sat alone at the kitchen island, a steaming mug of black coffee resting untouched beside the encrypted tablet Jonathan had provided. My hands were perfectly steady. The house was quiet save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I powered on the tablet, entering the complex sequence of passcodes Jonathan had instructed me to use. The screen flickered to life, dividing into multiple high-definition grids. The visual clarity was astonishing. I could see every corner of my living room and every shadow in my study, all captured through microscopic lenses, completely invisible to the naked eye. I pulled the cheap burner phone from my pocket and dialed Jonathan. He answered on the first ring, his voice crisp and strictly professional. "We have secure feeds," Jonathan said. "No trace of interference. I have my forensic accounting team monitoring the stream from our dedicated server. We are waiting for your son-in-law to make his move." I did not have to wait long. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the crunch of gravel signaled the arrival of a vehicle. I was sitting in my bedroom, intentionally leaving the main areas of the house empty. I had sent a text message to Victoria an hour earlier claiming I was feeling incredibly weak and was going to take a long medicated sleep. She had undoubtedly relayed that information to Preston, giving him the perfect window of opportunity. I stared at the tablet screen. The front door opened with a quiet click. Preston stepped into the hallway. He moved with a practiced predatory caution, stepping lightly on the hardwood floors to avoid making the old boards creak. He paused at the base of the staircase, listening intently for any sound coming from my bedroom. Satisfied that the heavy dose of antipsychotics was keeping me unconscious, he turned and walked directly into the study. The camera, positioned perfectly in the crown molding, captured his face in pristine detail. There was no hesitation in his movements. He knew exactly where he was going and what he was looking for. I watched, my jaw clenched, as the man who had married my daughter walked around my heavy mahogany desk. He knelt on the antique Persian rug, rolling the heavy woven fabric back to expose the bare floorboards beneath. He ran his fingers along the edge of the wood, finding the hidden latch, and lifted the false panel. The heavy steel door of my floor safe was exposed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key. The very same key I had pickpocketed from him, perfectly replicated at a local hardware store, before I discreetly dropped the copy back into his coat pocket during a feigned stumble the previous evening. He inserted the copied key into the lock, turned it sharply, and pulled the heavy door open. A sickening wave of violation washed over me, as I watched him reach his hands into my private vault. He pulled out thick manila folders containing the original deeds to the farm, the property lines, the bearer bonds, and the comprehensive outlines of my financial portfolios. He spread the documents across my desk like a feast. He pulled a sleek smartphone from his jacket pocket and activated the camera. For the next 20 minutes, the high-definition feed recorded Preston meticulously photographing every single page. He captured account numbers, routing codes, signature baselines, and legal descriptions of my assets. He was building a complete digital replica of my entire estate. I watched him carefully place the folders back into the safe lock, the steel door replace the floorboard, and roll the rug back into its exact original position. He left the house as silently as he had arrived. When the screen finally showed an empty room, Jonathan spoke through the burner phone. His voice was heavy with dark realization. "Harrison. We have a massive problem," Jonathan said, his tone stripped of any professional detachment. "I put my best forensic accountants on Preston yesterday morning. I told them to dig into his venture capital firm to tear apart his public filings and find out exactly what his financial situation looks like." "What did they find?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "It is a sham, Harrison. The entire firm is a hollow shell company. He has not made a profitable investment in over 4 years. He has been hemorrhaging money, living completely on credit, and floating loans to maintain the illusion of a successful corporate lifestyle. But it is much worse than just being broke. He owes money. A staggering amount of money." "How much?" I demanded. $15 million, Jonathan replied, the number hanging in the air like a physical threat. "And he does not owe it to conventional banks. He owes it to a shadow banking syndicate operating out of Chicago. These are not people who send collection letters, Harrison. These are ruthless, violent creditors who specialize in high-interest, off-the-books lending to desperate executives. Preston is completely backed into a corner, and his time is running out." I stared at the blank screen of the tablet, the pieces of the puzzle rapidly snapping into place. The fake vitamins, the isolated farm, the theft of the documents. "He is using my estate," I realized aloud, the cold truth settling over me. "That is exactly right," Jonathan confirmed. "He is using your assets as collateral to appease the syndicate. He needed the photographs of your deeds and your financial portfolios to prove to these people that he has access to substantial capital. We found newly registered holding companies in Delaware. He has already forged your signature on multiple loan guarantee documents. He is pledging the farm, your investments, and everything Diane left behind to save his own life. If he defaults on this shadow debt, the syndicate will not just come for him. They will come for the farm. They will take your property through fraudulent liens, and because he is establishing a paper trail of your mental incompetence, any court would assume you simply signed away the assets in a state of confusion. The absolute brilliance of their malicious plan left me momentarily breathless. Victoria and Preston were not just greedy children waiting for an inheritance. They were desperate criminals using my life as a shield against a violent cartel. They were systematically destroying my mind with chemical restraints, so I could not fight back when the syndicate arrived to seize the farm. Every sweet smile Victoria had given me, every cup of coffee she had poured, was a calculated step toward handing my legacy over to violent criminals. I looked around my kitchen thinking of Diane. We had built this life with our own hands. We had poured our blood and sweat into this land. The thought of losing it to a Chicago crime syndicate because of my son-in-law's reckless arrogance ignited a fire within me that burned hotter than any case I had ever prosecuted. The fire in my chest was unlike anything I had experienced in my 30 years as a federal prosecutor. I sat at my kitchen island staring at the encrypted tablet, while the reality of Jonathan's words echoed in the quiet room. $15 million. A shadow banking syndicate. My own daughter and her husband were perfectly willing to let violent criminals take my farm, my home, and my legacy just to cover their own reckless greed. They were drugging me to keep me docile while they signed my life away. I closed the connection with Jonathan and powered down the tablet. I knew I could take the camera footage to the police right now and have them arrested for elder abuse. But that was not enough. If I struck too early, Preston would claim he was merely organizing my files for my own protection. Victoria would cry in front of a judge claiming she was a devoted daughter, trying to help a father suffering from severe cognitive decline. They would hire expensive defense attorneys and spin a narrative of a tragic family misunderstanding. I needed them to cross a line they could never walk back from. I needed them to attempt a blatant, undeniable act of fraud right in front of the hidden lenses. I needed to force their hand. To do that, I had to create a ticking clock. I had to threaten the one thing they desperately needed to appease the Chicago syndicate: the farm. I dialed Victoria. I intentionally shallowed my breathing to make my voice sound frail. When she answered, her tone was brisk and impatient, the sound of a woman interrupted during a busy day. I asked her if she could come over to the house that afternoon. I told her I was having a rare good day, a small window where the fog in my brain had briefly cleared, and I needed to discuss something incredibly important regarding the future of the estate. I heard the hesitation in her voice, followed by the familiar calculating shift in her tone. She promised she would be there by 4 o'clock. I spent the next 2 hours preparing my performance. I brewed a pot of coffee and poured it down the sink, leaving an empty mug on the table. I ruffled my hair, unbuttoned the collar of my flannel shirt, and draped a heavy wool blanket over my knees as I sat in the leather armchair in the living room. I positioned myself perfectly within the optimal viewing angle of the micro camera. Jonathan's team had embedded in the crown molding. I was the bait, and I was sitting squarely in the center of the trap. At 4 o'clock, Victoria's vehicle crunched up the driveway. She walked through the front door a few moments later, carrying a plastic grocery bag filled with cheap soup cans, a pathetic prop to demonstrate her supposed caregiving. She set the bag on the counter and walked into the living room, stopping a few feet away from my chair. She looked at me with annoyance and forced sympathy. "You said you were having a clear day, Dad," she noted, her eyes darting around the room to ensure we were alone. "You sounded quite serious on the phone. What is going on?" I looked up at her, keeping my hands perfectly still to sell the illusion of temporary lucidity. I let my eyes well up with tears, drawing on the genuine heartbreak I felt over her betrayal. "Victoria," I began, letting my voice crack with manufactured sorrow. "I know what is happening to me. I know my mind is slipping away. The fog is getting thicker every single day. Soon I will not remember my own name, let alone the legacy we built on this land." I took a slow, rattling breath. She stepped closer, her posture stiffening. She was clearly trying to gauge whether this was a genuine moment of clarity or another symptom of the heavy antipsychotics she had been feeding me. "Oh, Dad." "Do not speak like that," she murmured, reaching out to pat my shoulder with a cold, hesitant hand. "The vitamins are helping. You just need more time." "No, Victoria," I insisted, gently pulling my shoulder away from her touch. "We both know the truth. I am losing the battle. But today, right now, my thoughts are clear. And I realize I have a profound responsibility to protect this property before I am entirely gone. I cannot let this beautiful farm decay while I sit in a nursing home. I cannot burden you and Preston with the heavy financial upkeep of this massive estate." She froze completely. Her hand hovered in the empty air between us. I watched the blood slowly drain from her face, leaving her skin a pale, sickly white. "What are you saying, Dad?" she asked, her voice dropping to a harsh, terrified whisper. I looked directly into her eyes, delivering the fatal blow with absolute precision. "I am saying that I called my estate lawyer this morning." I lied smoothly. I told him to draft the final paperwork. "This coming Monday at exactly 9 in the morning, I am signing the entire farm, the house, and the surrounding acreage over to the state agricultural charity. They will preserve the land in your mother's name forever. It is the only way to keep the property safe from developers and taxes. The estate will be gone, Victoria, but it will serve a noble purpose." Victoria stared at me as if I had just plunged a dagger into her chest. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. The meticulous, condescending mask she wore so flawlessly completely shattered. She needed this property to satisfy the violent syndicate breathing down her husband's neck. Without the farm as collateral, Preston was a dead man, and her lavish lifestyle would crumble. But Monday, she stammered, her eyes wide with unadulterated panic. "Dad, you cannot do that. You are not thinking clearly. You cannot just give away the family inheritance on a whim. Preston and I have plans for this place. You have to cancel that meeting." I shook my head slowly, letting a gentle, resigned smile touch my lips. "No, sweetheart," I whispered softly. "My mind is made up. The lawyer is filing the documents on Monday morning. Once my signature is on that paper, the transfer is irrevocable. It will be done." She took 2 steps backward, physically reeling from the absolute finality of my statement. Her hands began to shake with the very tremors she had been trying to artificially induce in me. She grabbed her purse from the sofa, unable to formulate a coherent sentence. "I have to go," she gasped, turning abruptly toward the hallway. "I will be right back." She practically sprinted out the front door, slamming it shut behind her. I listened to the frantic roar of her engine as she sped down the driveway. The ticking clock was loud. I had given them exactly 48 hours before the estate vanished. They could not wait. They would have to strike this weekend. The bait was taken, and the predators were rushing headlong into my trap. Friday morning arrived with a deceptive stillness. The heavy clouds from the previous days had broken, allowing a pale, thin sunlight to wash over the frost-covered pastures. I woke up at 5 o'clock, my mind sharper than it had been in months. The remaining chemical traces of the antipsychotics were completely gone from my bloodstream. I sat at my kitchen table with a hot cup of black coffee, opening my encrypted tablet to review the overnight surveillance footage. My trap was perfectly set. I had scheduled a final meeting with Jonathan Pierce for that afternoon to hand over the digital evidence, the toxicology reports, and the recorded video of Preston infiltrating my safe. We were going to file a massive federal injunction, freezing every single asset and triggering a criminal fraud investigation before the sun set. I felt a deep, resonant sense of vindication. I had outsmarted them. I was the veteran prosecutor who had lured the arrogant amateurs into a fatal legal ambush, but I had severely underestimated the sheer terrifying speed of a desperate man fighting for his life. At exactly 8:15, the tranquility of the morning was shattered by the harsh crunch of heavy tires tearing up my gravel driveway. I did not hear just one vehicle. I heard a convoy. I walked to the kitchen window and pulled back the curtain. My blood ran cold. 3 county sheriff cruisers were parked at aggressive angles across my front lawn, their light bars flashing bright blue and red against the morning frost. Behind them, a sterile white passenger van bearing the seal of the Department of Social Services blocked the main exit. Doors slammed in unison. Uniformed deputies stepped out, adjusting their utility belts, moving with the cautious, practiced tension of law enforcement responding to a volatile situation. 2 individuals in plain civilian clothes, a man and a woman holding thick clipboards, stepped out of the white van and flanked the officers. I stood frozen by the sink. My entire federal case, my meticulously planned counterattack, was still sitting in an encrypted file on the kitchen island. I had played the bait too well. I had forced a ticking clock onto Preston and Victoria, anticipating they would try to force my signature on a new deed over the weekend. Instead, they had bypassed me completely. They had used the legal system itself as a weapon, launching a preemptive strike with terrifying efficiency. Heavy authoritative knocks pounded against my front door. The sound echoed through the farmhouse like gunfire. I took a deep breath, forcing my racing heart to slow down. I had to maintain the facade. I ruffled my hair, hunched my shoulders, and shuffled toward the foyer, letting my hands develop a visible, violent tremor. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. A tall sheriff deputy with a stern face stood on the porch, flanked by the 2 social workers. Harrison Caldwell. The deputy asked, his tone not leaving any room for debate. Yes, I stammered, making my voice sound weak and hopelessly confused. What is happening here? Is there a problem? The female social worker stepped forward, her face a mask of practiced clinical sympathy. Mr. Caldwell, my name is Brenda. We are here from Adult Protective Services. We have received an emergency court order regarding your immediate welfare and the management of your estate. She handed me a thick stack of legal documents stapled together. The heavy black text on the first page jumped out at me, hitting me with the force of a physical blow. It was an emergency ex parte conservatorship order, signed and stamped by a county judge just hours ago. An ex parte order meant it had been filed and granted in secret without my knowledge, without my presence, and without giving me any opportunity to defend myself in a courtroom. It is a legal maneuver strictly reserved for the most extreme life-threatening cases of mental collapse. I stared at the paperwork, letting my hands shake so hard the pages rattled. "This cannot be right," I whispered, staring blindly at the deputy. "I am fine. I am perfectly fine. I just woke up to drink my coffee." "I am sorry, sir," the deputy said, his hand resting cautiously on his service belt. "But the judge has temporarily stripped you of your legal autonomy. You are no longer permitted to make financial or medical decisions for yourself, nor are you allowed to remain on this property unsupervised. We are here to escort you to a secure medical facility for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation." Before I could even formulate a response, another vehicle sped up the driveway. It was Preston's luxury sedan. He slammed on the brakes, throwing the car into park, and leapt out, rushing toward the porch with Victoria close behind him. Victoria was crying, clutching a tissue to her face, playing the role of the devastated, heartbroken daughter to absolute perfection. Preston rushed past the deputies, looking at me with a sickening display of profound sorrow. "Oh, Dad!" Victoria sobbed, reaching out to grab my arm. "I am so sorry it had to come to this. We tried so hard to take care of you at home, but you are just slipping away too fast. We had to protect you from yourself." I looked at her, and then I looked down at the documents trembling in my hands. The attached exhibits told the entire horrifying story. Preston had not just used his shadow syndicate connections for loans. He had used them to purchase forged medical documentation. There were signed affidavits from 2 private out-of-state neurologists who had never even met me, testifying that I was suffering from aggressive late-stage chemical dementia. The documents perfectly detailed the exact symptoms the antipsychotic drugs had forced upon my body. The severe tremors, the lethargy, the violent outbursts of paranoia, the wandering into the freezing cold night. They had weaponized my own survival tactic against me. Every time I had faked a symptom to protect my investigation, I was inadvertently building their legal case for my own institutionalization. Victoria had recorded my late-night wanderings and my confused ramblings. She had presented them to the judge as tragic proof that I was entirely incapable of managing a multi-million-dollar estate. I had told her I was giving the farm to charity on Monday, and she had countered by legally erasing my existence on Friday morning. "Please, you have to listen to me," I begged, turning toward the social worker, dropping my voice into a desperate, panicked plea. "They are lying to you. They have been poisoning me." Brenda sighed, offering a sad, patronizing smile. "We know about the medication, Mr. Caldwell. Your daughter explained that you have been refusing your prescribed treatments and hiding your pills. That is why you are experiencing these severe paranoid delusions. It is a common symptom of your condition. We are just going to get you some help." Preston smirked triumphantly as the tall deputies escorted me outside toward the waiting van. I lowered my head, hiding a subtle smile. They had missed the hidden burner phone in my pocket. The cold morning air bit deeply through my thin cotton pajamas as the 2 heavily armed deputies guided me toward the back of the waiting transport van. Their grips on my arms were firm, but not overly aggressive. They genuinely believed they were handling a frail, demented old man, not a seasoned federal prosecutor. Before allowing me to step up into the massive vehicle, the taller deputy conducted a standard pat-down. He thoroughly checked my pockets and pulled out my standard smartphone and my heavy ring of house keys. He handed them directly to Brenda, the social worker, who solemnly placed them into a plastic evidence bag. They were officially confiscating my life. But the deputy did not check the deep interior pocket of my heavy wool cardigan. That was where the small plastic burner phone sat, nestled silently against my chest. It was my very last remaining lifeline to Jonathan and reality. I stood by the open doors of the van, putting on a masterful display of manufactured confusion. I allowed my lower lip to tremble. I looked back at the farmhouse, letting my eyes dart around, as if I could not comprehend what was happening. Victoria was standing on the porch, putting on a performance that rivaled my own. She was weeping openly, her face buried in a crumpled tissue. Preston stood beside her, playing the role of the supportive husband. Brenda approached them with a look of professional sympathy. She placed a comforting hand on Victoria's shoulder, assuring my daughter that the facility would keep me safe and that the conservatorship would protect my assets from my deteriorating mind. It was sickening to watch. Victoria nodded bravely, wiping a fake tear from her cheek, and asked Brenda if she could have one last moment to say goodbye to her father. Brenda smiled gently and stepped aside, gesturing for Victoria to approach the van. The deputies loosened their hold on my arms, giving us a momentary illusion of family privacy. Victoria walked slowly down the wooden steps and crossed the gravel driveway. Her face was a portrait of absolute devastation to anyone watching from a distance. But as she drew closer, the sorrow in her eyes vanished, replaced by an icy, triumphant gleam. She stepped into my personal space, wrapping her arms tightly around my neck in what appeared to be a desperate, loving embrace. I let my head rest against her shoulder, playing the part of the bewildered patriarch. She pressed her mouth directly against my ear. Her breath was warm, but her voice was as cold as the frost covering my lawn. "Do not fight it, Dad," she whispered the words, slicing through the air like a razor blade. "You lost. We are in charge now. Just go quietly, and maybe I will put you in one of the nicer facilities." She pulled back, kissed me softly on the cheek, and let out another loud, dramatic sob for the benefit of the social workers. I looked at her, letting my hands shake, giving her the satisfaction of thinking I was terrified. She turned and walked back to Preston, burying her face in his chest. The deputies gently guided me up the steps and into the back of the transport van. The heavy metal transport doors slammed shut securely behind me, plunging the compartment into a dim, sterile light. I heard the lock engage from the outside. The engine roared to life, and the van began to move slowly down the long dirt driveway, taking me away from the only home I had known for 30 years. I sat on the hard plastic bench, listening to the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt. As the initial shock of the ambush began to fade, a dark, suffocating realization washed over me. The bitter irony of my situation was almost too profound to process. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back exactly 25 years. During my prime years in the federal prosecutor office, I had been appointed to a special state commission tasked with rewriting the very conservatorship laws that were currently being used to strip me of my freedom. At the time, there had been an epidemic of financial predators targeting vulnerable seniors. I had spent countless long nights sitting at my mahogany desk, poring over legal precedents, drafting airtight statutes designed to freeze assets instantly when severe cognitive decline was proven. I was the one who wrote the specific emergency ex parte loophole. I had personally designed that strict legal mechanism to allow social services to bypass standard courtroom delays if two neurologists signed sworn affidavits proving an immediate threat to the vulnerable patient. I had championed that law. I had stood before the state legislature and argued passionately that this rapid intervention was the only way to save victims before their estates could be drained by scammers. It was widely considered my legal masterpiece, a shield for the defenseless. And now my own daughter had turned my masterpiece into a weapon, using the exact legal framework I had constructed to orchestrate the perfect crime. She had weaponized my own words, my own statutes, and my own legacy to lock me away. The people I was meant to protect were the ones currently driving me to a locked psychiatric ward. Her brilliant legal maneuver was undeniable, but it was built entirely on absolute fraud. The medical records were forged. The symptoms were chemically induced. The narrative was a complete fabrication. They had successfully weaponized the law against its creator. But they had made one fatal error. They assumed that by removing me from the farm and taking my primary cell phone, they had severed my ability to fight back. They thought the game was over. They did not know about the hidden cameras recording every inch of my study. They did not know that Jonathan Pierce was sitting in his downtown office holding digital copies of their shadow banking debts and the video of Preston accessing my safe. And most importantly, they did not know about the small plastic burner phone resting securely against my chest. I reached my right hand inside the thick wool of my cardigan and traced the rectangular outline of the device with my thumb. The van hit a pothole, jostling me slightly, but I remained perfectly still on the bench. I did not need to make a call right now. I just needed to survive the mandatory psychiatric evaluation. I knew exactly how those evaluations worked. I knew the questions the doctors would ask, the cognitive tests they would administer, and the specific behavioral markers they would look for. Once the harsh antipsychotics were entirely out of my system, my mind would be as sharp as a scalpel. I would pass their tests flawlessly. I would easily prove my mental competence. And the moment I was alone in a secure room, I would pull out the burner phone and authorize Jonathan to drop the hammer. Victoria and Preston truly believed they had successfully imprisoned me. They had absolutely no idea they had unknowingly given me the perfect legal alibi, while my final trap snapped firmly shut around their greedy throats. They had absolutely no idea they had unknowingly given me the perfect legal alibi, while my final trap snapped firmly shut around their greedy throats. The transport van ride felt like a descent into a clinical purgatory. When we arrived at the high-security behavioral health facility on the outskirts of the county, I offered absolutely zero resistance. I knew that any display of anger, any assertion of my legal rights, or any demand to speak with an attorney would immediately be documented as combative paranoia. Instead, I let my shoulders slump. I shuffled my feet across the linoleum floors. I stared blankly at the intake nurses, offering only confused murmurs when they asked for my basic information. They cataloged my confiscated personal items, took my vital signs, and escorted me down a long, sterile corridor to a private room. The heavy door clicked shut, the electronic lock engaging with a solid, echoing thud. Through the narrow, reinforced glass window in the center of the door, I could see a burly orderly take his position in the hallway. I was officially a prisoner of the state, trapped within a system I had helped design. The room was deliberately sparse. A narrow bed bolted to the floor, a single chair, and a small adjoining bathroom with no mirrors. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, listening to the heavy footsteps of the orderly pacing outside. I waited for 2 agonizing hours, ensuring that the initial intake rounds were completely finished. I listened to the shifting routines of the facility until a deep silence settled over the wing. Once I was certain I was not being actively observed, I slipped my hand into the deep pocket of my wool cardigan. My fingers wrapped around the small plastic burner phone. Moving with agonizing slowness, I slid the device out and immediately slipped it beneath the thin mattress, creating a secure hiding spot, just in case a nurse conducted a random room search. I sat perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the door. The orderly outside had stopped pacing and appeared to be reading a magazine. I slid my hand back under the mattress, retrieving the phone. I kept the device low, shielded by my body, and turned the screen brightness down to the absolute minimum setting. The walls were thin, and even a whisper might alert the staff. I typed a rapid text to Jonathan Pierce. I gave him the name of the facility and explained the ex parte emergency order, the forged medical affidavits, and the rapid extraction from the farm. It took 30 seconds for Jonathan to reply. His text was brief, but the fury behind his words was palpable. They bypassed the standard docket, he wrote. They used a specific emergency loophole to strip your rights without a preliminary hearing. But that order is only temporary. By law, they must hold a formal evidentiary hearing within 72 hours to solidify the conservatorship and make it permanent. That gives us exactly 3 days. I stared at the glowing text, my legal mind instantly shifting into overdrive. 72 hours. It was a narrow window, but it was enough. I typed my response outlining the parameters of our counterattack. We need to let them think they have won, I wrote. Do not file any immediate motions to contest the hold. Do not alert their legal team. Let them walk into that courtroom on Monday morning believing I am entirely defenseless. Jonathan replied instantly. My forensic accountants have officially broken through the shadow corporate layers. We have the paper trail connecting his venture capital firm directly to the Chicago syndicate. We have the loan guarantees featuring your forged signature. My technical team has perfectly preserved the high-definition surveillance footage of Preston opening your floor safe and photographing your assets. It is completely irrefutable. We will bury them. I read his words, feeling a surge of cold, methodical satisfaction. We needed to ensure every single piece of their fraud was exposed simultaneously. I instructed Jonathan to silently subpoena the 2 out-of-state neurologists who had signed the fake medical affidavits. We both knew those doctors were likely paid off using the syndicate money, and under the threat of federal perjury charges, they would crumble instantly on the witness stand. I also told him to prepare a massive federal injunction ready to be filed the very second the hearing commenced. We were going to hit them with a shockwave of legal destruction so absolute that they would not even have time to blink. Jonathan agreed to the strategy. His final message contained a stark warning. You have to play your part flawlessly, Harrison. The doctors at that facility are going to evaluate you. They will try to provoke a reaction. Victoria will undoubtedly visit you to establish a record of your cognitive decline. You cannot break character. If they suspect for 1 second that your mind is sharp, they might panic and alert the syndicate to move on the farm before the hearing. I will be the perfect broken old man, I typed back. I will see you in court. I powered down the burner phone and slid it back into its hiding place deep inside the mattress. I lay back on the stiff bed, staring up at the sterile white ceiling tiles. The bitter irony of my situation washed over me again, but this time it did not feel like a defeat. It felt like a necessary crucible. I was a prisoner locked in a psychiatric ward, stripped of my identity, my property, and my freedom. But inside my mind, I was free, and I was holding a match to the powder keg they had built around themselves. The next 48 hours were an absolute test of my endurance and my acting abilities. I adopted a vacant, hollow stare. When the facility psychiatrists came to evaluate me, I answered their questions with slow, deliberate confusion. I mixed up dates. I claimed I did not know what city I was in. I asked for Diane. I let my hands tremble, and I refused to eat the bland cafeteria food, letting my physical appearance deteriorate to match the forged medical profile Victoria had created. The doctors took meticulous notes, nodding with practiced sympathy, entirely convinced that they were observing a tragic case of rapid-onset dementia. Victoria visited me on Sunday afternoon. She walked into my small room accompanied by an orderly carrying a bouquet of cheap flowers. She wore a solemn expression, but her eyes danced with absolute victory. She sat in the chair next to my bed, speaking to me as if I were a toddler. She told me not to worry about the farm, assuring me that Preston was handling all the paperwork to keep it safe. I looked at her, letting a thin trail of saliva escape the corner of my mouth, and murmured incoherently. She smiled a cold, reptilian stretch of her lips and patted my hand. She left the room convinced her inheritance was secured. She had no idea she had just walked into the final hours of her freedom. The trap was locked. Monday morning arrived with a cold and relentless drizzle. The facility staff woke me just before dawn to prepare for the transport to the county courthouse. A stern orderly handed me a plastic bag containing a change of clothes that Victoria had supposedly packed and sent over from the farmhouse. It was a calculated insult. Instead of one of my tailored suits, she had sent a faded plaid country shirt, a pair of worn denim trousers, and my scuffed leather work boots. She even included an old battered canvas hat I used for gardening. The intention was crystal clear. She wanted me to walk into that courtroom looking exactly like a confused, unkempt farmer who had completely lost his grip on reality and basic hygiene. I put the clothes on slowly, letting my hands tremble as I fumbled with the buttons on the shirt. I did not comb my hair. I allowed the gray stubble on my cheeks to remain untouched. When the transport deputies arrived to escort me, I shuffled my feet and kept my head bowed, clutching the worn hat tightly to my chest. I looked like a man who had already surrendered. The drive to the courthouse took 45 minutes. I sat in the back of the transport van, watching the city streets blur past through the wire mesh window. My mind was sharp, evaluating every possible angle of the upcoming legal confrontation. Jonathan and I had coordinated our moves perfectly the night before. I knew exactly what role I needed to play. The van pulled into the secure loading bay at the rear of the courthouse. The heavy doors swung open, and the freezing rain hit my face. The deputies guided me up the concrete stairs and through the bleak institutional corridors of the holding area. We walked past holding cells and busy clerks moving toward the designated civil family courtrooms. Every step I took was deliberate. I dragged my left boot, slightly simulating the physical decline Victoria had described in her fraudulent medical filings. We finally reached the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4. The deputy pushed the doors open, and a hush immediately fell over the room as we stepped inside. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the polished floorboards, but my peripheral vision captured everything. The courtroom was relatively empty, standard for closed conservatorship hearings. Sitting at the plaintiff table was Victoria, dressed in a conservative dark navy suit that screamed responsible daughter. Beside her sat Preston, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a look of profound, practiced somberness. They had hired a high-powered litigator from a prestigious city firm, a tall man with slicked back hair and an expensive silk tie. I was guided to the defense table. I sat down heavily, placing my worn hat on the table in front of me. I let my shoulders slump forward, resting my chin near my chest. I risked a brief upward glance. Victoria was looking at me. A subtle, incredibly cruel smirk played at the very corners of her mouth. It was the look of a predator watching a trapped animal breathe its last breath. Preston leaned over and whispered something to his wife, shaking his head with the display of fake, patronizing pity. They were entirely convinced that they had executed the perfect crime. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge. Everyone in the room stood, except for me. I remained seated, playing the part of a man too disoriented to understand basic courtroom protocols. The deputy standing behind me gently nudged my shoulder, but I merely let out a confused, rattling breath. The judge, a stern-looking woman with graying hair and sharp glasses, took her seat at the elevated bench. She looked down at me with a mixture of professional detachment and quiet sympathy. The high-priced lawyer standing next to Victoria immediately launched into his opening statement. He spoke with the smooth, polished cadence of a man who was used to winning unopposed battles. "Your Honor," he began, his voice echoing through the quiet chamber. "We are here today under incredibly tragic circumstances. We are petitioning the court to make the emergency conservatorship of Mr. Harrison Caldwell permanent. This is not a decision his family has made lightly, but it is one made out of absolute, unavoidable necessity for his own physical and financial safety." The lawyer picked up a thick binder from his table and held it up for the judge to see. He proceeded to present a slam-dunk case of severe, irreversible dementia. He walked the judge through the forged medical records with clinical precision. He cited the sworn affidavits from the 2 out-of-state neurologists detailing a rapid and aggressive cognitive collapse. He read passages describing my supposed symptoms, the violent paranoia, the inability to recognize my own family members, and the complete loss of short-term memory. He painted a masterful, devastating portrait of a man whose mind had dissolved into a dark, terrifying abyss. I listened to his lies without moving a single muscle. I kept my eyes focused on the scuffed toes of my work boots. The lawyer then turned his attention to the financial aspects of the estate. He described the vast acreage of the farm and the complex investment portfolios I managed. He argued that leaving such a massive estate in the hands of a man suffering from severe delusions was not just irresponsible, it was actively dangerous. To solidify his argument, the lawyer directed the attention of the court to a large monitor positioned near the witness stand. He played the video Victoria had recorded on her cell phone the night of my manufactured crisis. The screen lit up with the image of me standing barefoot in the freezing gravel, wearing thin pajamas, weeping openly, and screaming for my deceased wife. The audio of my pathetic, confused rambling filled the courtroom. It was incredibly difficult to watch myself in that state, even knowing it was a calculated performance. The judge watched the screen intently, her expression softening into profound sadness. The lawyer paused the video, letting the tragic image linger in the air. As you can clearly see, Your Honor, my client's father is a profound danger to himself. He wanders into freezing temperatures. He suffers from vivid hallucinations. He is entirely incapable of making rational decisions regarding his medical care or his extensive assets. We respectfully request that his daughter Victoria be granted full and permanent control over his estate to ensure his safety and preserve his legacy. The lawyer closed his heavy binder and stepped back, offering a solemn, respectful nod to the presiding judge. Victoria reached out and gently squeezed Preston's hand, wiping a single, meticulously manufactured tear from her cheek with a white tissue. The entire courtroom was completely silent. Everyone was waiting for me to react, to shout, to protest, or to cry out in helpless confusion. I remained absolutely motionless in my wooden chair. I kept my head bowed and my eyes locked onto the floorboards. I let them fully bathe in their false victory, waiting patiently for the ultimate legal trap to finally spring completely shut forever. The silence in courtroom 4 stretched for several long, agonizing moments. Judge Gregory Mitchell adjusted his heavy, dark-framed glasses and let out a quiet sigh. He looked down at the documents spread across his elevated bench, organizing the forged medical affidavits and the fraudulent financial assessments into a neat stack. I could hear the faint rustle of paper as he prepared to deliver his ruling. Victoria shifted in her seat, across the aisle, the fabric of her expensive navy suit rubbing against the polished wood of the plaintiff table. She let out another soft, manufactured sniffle, playing her part to the very end. The high-priced litigator standing beside her cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie with an air of absolute confidence. He believed he was simply wrapping up a routine, unopposed conservatorship hearing. Judge Mitchell finally picked up his wooden gavel and cleared his throat to speak. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Mitchell began, his voice carrying a tone of gentle, practiced authority designed to soothe those suffering from cognitive decline. "I know this process can be incredibly confusing and frightening. I need you to look at me, sir, so I can ensure you understand what is happening in this courtroom today." I kept my chin tucked against my chest for 3 full seconds. I wanted the anticipation to build. I wanted Victoria and Preston to feel the absolute peak of their false triumph before I shattered it into a million pieces. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my head. I let the slumped curve of my spine straighten. I placed my hands flat on the defense table, stopping the fabricated tremors instantly. I lifted my gaze and locked my eyes directly onto the man sitting behind the elevated mahogany bench. The transformation in Judge Gregory Mitchell was instantaneous and violently dramatic. The moment his eyes connected with mine, the professional, sympathetic expression completely melted from his face. All the color drained rapidly from his cheeks, leaving his skin the shade of old parchment. The heavy wooden gavel slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the sound block with a dull, hollow clatter that echoed sharply through the silent room. He physically recoiled in his high-backed leather chair, pressing his shoulders against the upholstery as if an electric shock had just traveled through his spine. He reached up with a shaking hand and removed his glasses, blinking rapidly as if trying to clear an impossible illusion from his vision. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The entire courtroom froze, entirely confused by the sudden, terrifying shift in the presiding judge. "My God," Judge Mitchell whispered, his voice incredibly thin and breathless. carrying across the silent chamber without the need for a microphone. Is it really him? The slick litigator representing my daughter frowned in deep confusion. He stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Your Honor, the lawyer asked, his smooth cadence faltering for the very first time. Is everything all right? Do we need to call a medical professional for the respondent? Judge Mitchell did not even acknowledge the lawyer. His eyes remained permanently fixed on my face, widening with a profound mixture of absolute shock, immense respect, and palpable fear. He was not looking at a broken, unkempt farmer wearing a plaid shirt and scuffed boots. He was looking directly into the past. He was looking at the ghost of the man who had forged his entire career. Yes, Gregory, I said. My voice was no longer frail or confused. It resonated through the courtroom with the deep, commanding baritone I had perfected over 30 years of prosecuting the most dangerous criminals in the state. It has been a very long time. The sound of my true voice hit Victoria like a physical blow. I heard her gasp sharply, a sudden ragged intake of air that betrayed her instant panic. Preston stiffened in his chair, his posture snapping rigid as the confident smirk was wiped completely off his face. The high-priced lawyer whipped his head back and forth between the judge and me, thoroughly bewildered by the sudden authority radiating from the man he had just spent 20 minutes painting as a helpless, delusional vegetable. He opened his mouth to object, but Judge Mitchell held up a trembling hand to silence him. You are Harrison Caldwell, Judge Mitchell stated, leaning forward over the bench, ignoring every standard protocol of courtroom decorum. You are the Harrison Caldwell. The lawyer practically jumped in his expensive shoes. Yes, Your Honor, the lawyer interjected, his voice rising in panic. That is the respondent. We have clearly established his identity and his severe cognitive deterioration in the medical filings. Judge Mitchell snapped his gaze toward the lawyer, his eyes burning with a sudden, intense fury. Shut your mouth, counselor, the judge barked, his voice echoing like thunder. You have absolutely no idea who is sitting at that defense table. 30 years ago, I was a struggling, desperate law intern. I made a terrible mistake that nearly ended my career before it even started. That man sitting right there stepped in, took me under his wing, and saved my professional life. The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet. Victoria was breathing in rapid, shallow pants, her hands gripping the edge of the plaintiff table so hard her knuckles turned a solid, bruised white. Preston was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that the helpless old man he had been drugging was a meticulously crafted illusion. Judge Mitchell turned his attention back to me, his voice softening with profound reverence. He is the most ruthless, brilliant, and honorable federal prosecutor this state has ever seen, the judge continued, addressing the silent room, but speaking directly to my daughter's paralyzed attorney. He authored the very conservatorship statutes you are currently attempting to use in my courtroom today. He wrote the emergency ex parte provisions you filed on Friday morning. Are you seriously standing there telling me that the architect of this state's financial protection laws has lost his mind? The slick litigator took a step backward, his professional composure completely shattered. He looked down at his thick binder of forged records, and then looked at Victoria, his eyes demanding an explanation she was entirely incapable of giving. Your Honor, the lawyer stammered, his voice weak and unsure. We have sworn affidavits from 2 certified medical professionals. The judge slammed his hand flat against the wood of his desk. I do not care what papers you have in that binder, Judge Mitchell roared. I know the man sitting in front of me. I know his mind. The dynamic in the room shifted so violently that the air felt heavy. I remained perfectly still, watching the absolute terror take hold of my daughter and her husband. I had them exactly where I wanted them. The stage was finally set for my ultimate revenge. The arrogant lawyer released his grip, allowing the heavy binder to crash onto the polished floor. Victoria buried her face in her trembling hands, letting out a genuine, suffocating sob of pure defeat. They both finally realized the horrifying truth simultaneously. The perfect crime was completely over. I had won. I let the silence hang in the air for a few moments longer, allowing the absolute gravity of the situation to crush the remaining breath from their lungs. Then I slowly opened my fingers. The battered canvas hat fell from my grasp, hitting the polished floor with a soft, dismissive thud. I placed my hands flat on the defense table and pushed myself upward. The stooped, fragile posture I had maintained for weeks vanished instantly. I drew my shoulders back, lifted my chin, and stood at my full height. The trembling in my hands ceased. My gaze hardened into the cold, penetrating stare that had once made hardened criminals break down in interrogation rooms. I looked at the opposing counsel, watching the arrogant litigator shrink back, as if he had been physically struck by an unseen force. The confident smirk that had been plastered across his face just a few moments prior dissolved into a mask of pure uncertainty. I turned my attention to the bench. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the stillness like a finely sharpened blade. "With the permission of the court, I am formally requesting to waive my right to appointed counsel. I will be representing myself in this matter." Judge Gregory Mitchell did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Permission is unequivocally granted, Mr. Caldwell." The judge replied, his voice thick with profound respect. "The floor is entirely yours." Right on cue, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding crash. Jonathan Pierce strode into the chamber, moving with the relentless momentum of an approaching storm. He was wearing his signature charcoal suit, radiating absolute authority. Behind him, 2 paralegals pushed a heavy metal trolley burdened with 6 large, tightly packed banker's boxes. The wheels squeaked sharply against the floorboards, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the room. Jonathan marched straight down the center aisle, completely ignoring the frantic, terrified stares of my daughter and her husband. He bypassed their table entirely, not even offering them a single fleeting glance of recognition, and positioned the trolley directly beside me. He offered me a single grim nod before stepping back. I placed my hand on the top box. "Your Honor," I continued, my tone ringing with absolute clarity. "The petition before you today is not a tragic plea for the protection of a deteriorating patriarch. It is the final desperate act of a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy. The petitioners are attempting to use this courtroom to finalize a $15 million fraud." I turned to look directly at Preston. His face was slick with a cold sweat. He looked like a man standing on the gallows. I reached into the first box and pulled out a thick stack of printed transcripts and financial records. "Opposing counsel has presented you with sworn medical affidavits detailing my supposed cognitive collapse," I stated, walking slowly toward the center of the room. "He claims 2 independent neurologists diagnosed me with late-stage chemical dementia." I placed the documents on the edge of the judge's bench. "What counsel does not know is that my legal team served federal subpoenas to both of those out-of-state doctors yesterday evening. When faced with the threat of federal perjury charges and the immediate loss of their medical licenses, they were remarkably forthcoming. They confessed to accepting wire transfers of $50,000 each to sign those blank affidavits." I turned to look at the slick litigator. The man looked physically ill. He began frantically packing his briefcase, shaking his head in a desperate attempt to distance himself from the toxic fallout. I did not stop. I pulled a small clear plastic evidence bag from my pocket and held it up. The bag contained the white capsules Victoria had forced upon me. The symptoms described in those forged medical records were indeed real, I explained, my voice growing colder with every word. "Because my daughter, the loving petitioner, has been systematically poisoning me for the last 4 weeks. She replaced my daily vitamin supplements with a heavy, dangerous regimen of unprescribed antipsychotic medications designed to induce severe tremors, lethargy, and temporary paranoia. She weaponized a chemical restraint to manufacture the exact visual evidence she needed to steal my autonomy." Victoria let out a strangled, pathetic whimper, burying her face deeper into her hands. But she was only half of the equation. I turned my full, terrifying focus onto Preston. He tried to look away, but I stepped closer to their table, forcing him to face me. The medical fraud was merely the key to unlock the vault. I told the court, my voice echoing off the high ceiling. The true motivation sits at the plaintiff table. Preston has projected the image of a highly successful venture capitalist. In reality, his firm is a bankrupt shell. He has not made a profitable investment in 4 years. He is currently $15 million in debt to an illicit shadow banking syndicate operating out of Chicago, a violent organization that does not accept apologies for late payments. I walked back to the trolley and pulled out a tablet, connecting it to the courtroom monitors. To save his own life, he needed collateral. He needed my farm, my acreage, and my financial portfolios. When he could not convince me to sign them over, he stole the key to my floor safe. The courtroom screens flickered to life. The crystal-clear, high-definition surveillance footage began to play. Every single eye in the room watched Preston creep into my study. They watched him roll back the heavy Persian rug, open the hidden safe, and meticulously photograph my private deeds and bearer bonds. The silence was absolute as the digital proof of his undeniable felony infiltration played out for the silent judge. He used these photographs to forge my signature on multiple loan guarantee documents. I stated, my voice echoing over the undeniable video evidence. He pledged my entire estate to a criminal syndicate to cover his shadow debt. The emergency conservatorship filed on Friday was his desperate attempt to finalize the legal transfer of those assets before I could sign the farm over to a state charity. He was not protecting me. He was feeding me to the wolves to save himself. The arrogant litigator finally snapped his briefcase shut, abandoned his clients at the table, and literally sprinted toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chamber. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with the incredibly monumental criminal conspiracy I had just systematically ripped wide open. Victoria was hyperventilating, clawing at the collar of her expensive navy suit, unable to escape the crushing weight of her imminent destruction. Preston sat completely frozen in his chair, his eyes hollow and vacant, as he stared at the damning surveillance footage looping on the screens. They were completely broken, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. I turned back to face the elevated bench, looking directly at Judge Gregory Mitchell. I am not a helpless old man, Your Honor. I am Harrison Caldwell, and I am filing formal criminal charges against the two of them right here today. I reached into the second banker box Jonathan had placed beside me, withdrawing a thick blue evidentiary folder. I opened it and extracted a certified laboratory document, holding it up so the judge could clearly see the embossed seal. Your Honor, I stated, my voice steady and unwavering. The medical affidavits opposing counsel submitted rely on symptoms I actively exhibited over the past month. However, those symptoms were not the result of cognitive decay. They were chemically induced. I am submitting into evidence a comprehensive independent toxicology report. 4 days before they dragged me from my home, my attorney arranged for a covert blood and hair follicle analysis. The results conclusively prove a systematic daily ingestion of a powerful, unprescribed antipsychotic medication. I pulled a secondary sheet of paper from the folder, a crisp financial statement. Furthermore, I am submitting the corresponding financial trace. This is a certified credit card statement belonging to my daughter, Victoria Caldwell. It details a cash transaction at an out-of-state unregulated pharmacy exactly 5 weeks ago. The purchase corresponds perfectly with the exact dosage and timeline of the chemical restraints found in my bloodstream. She did not just observe my mental decline. She manufactured it, poisoning her own father to fabricate the medical grounds for this conservatorship. A collective gasp echoed from the sparse gallery. Victoria clutched her throat, her chest heaving as she let out a piercing, high-pitched wail of absolute panic. The pristine facade she had maintained for weeks was crumbling into dust right before my eyes. She began to shake uncontrollably, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for a hidden exit. I did not pause to let them recover. I reached into the third box and pulled out a portable high-capacity digital drive. I handed it to the bailiff, who formally presented it to the bench. This drive contains the raw, unedited 4K resolution footage captured by the concealed cameras in my private study. I explained, my tone turning razor-sharp. Opposing counsel briefly witnessed a segment of this recording, but the full-time stamped file is now officially submitted into the permanent court record. It shows Preston systematically bypassing my security measures. You can clearly observe him using specialized tools to crack the analog combination dial of my floor safe. The visual clarity is so absolute that you can read the serial numbers on the bearer bonds he is photographing. Preston was trembling violently. The tailored charcoal suit he wore now looked entirely too large for his shrinking frame. He opened his mouth, stammering nonsensical syllables, desperately searching for a lie that could possibly explain away the crystal-clear digital proof of his burglary. But there was no explanation. He had been caught red-handed invading my inner sanctum, stealing the very financial instruments he was meant to protect. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning a stark, bruised white under the immense pressure of the terrifying moment before Preston could form a coherent sentence. I pulled the final, most devastating piece of evidence from the boxes. I slammed a heavy stack of forensic accounting audits onto the defense table. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. The burglary was not an isolated incident, I announced to the paralyzed room. I am submitting the complete unredacted financial trace of Preston's venture capital firm. These documents, verified by 3 independent forensic auditors, expose a massive hidden shadow debt. He owes $15 million to an illicit syndicate, a debt that has been accumulating compounding interest for 4 years. I held up a series of legal contracts, their pages marked with bright red evidentiary tags. To satisfy the demands of his violent creditors, Preston needed collateral. He needed my farm, my liquid assets, and my entire estate. I am submitting these loan guarantee documents, which feature my forged signature. Preston utilized the photographs he took from my safe to construct a perfect replica of my legal authorization. He pledged everything I have worked my entire life to build, to cover his own reckless criminal gambling. The emergency ex parte order they filed on Friday was their absolute last resort to finalize the legal transfer of my estate before the syndicate tore them apart. They needed me declared legally incompetent, so I could not contest the fraudulent transfers that were scheduled to execute this very afternoon. Judge Gregory Mitchell stared at the mountain of undeniable proof before him. His expression hardened from profound shock into a mask of pure, righteous, judicial fury. He looked down at the plaintiff table, his eyes burning with a contempt so deep it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. Victoria was screaming now, a continuous hysterical string of denials and frantic apologies that completely drowned out the steady rhythm of the rain hitting the courtroom windows. She clawed at her husband's arm, begging him to fix the unfixable disaster they had walked directly into. Her perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess, her expensive suit wrinkled as she thrashed against the reality of her impending incarceration. She looked exactly like the terrified, trapped animal she had believed me to be just minutes prior. Preston did not look at his wife. He looked at the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. The primal animalistic instinct to survive suddenly overrode any remaining shred of rational thought in his mind. He forcefully shoved Victoria away, knocking her chair backward with a violent, uncaring thrust. She spilled onto the polished floorboards in a tangle of navy fabric and terrified sobs, her hands reaching out into the empty air. Preston lunged forward, scrambling over the plaintiff table and bolting down the center aisle toward the exit. He was sprinting for his life, completely blinded by adrenaline, desperate to escape the immediate crushing weight of federal prison and the violent syndicate waiting for their money outside. He did not even make it halfway down the long aisle. Judge Mitchell slammed his gavel down, the sound ringing out like a thunderclap across the vaulted ceiling. "Bailiffs, secure that man immediately," the judge bellowed, his voice commanding absolute obedience from the court officers. 3 heavily armed bailiffs converged on Preston, instantly moving with swift, practiced, tactical precision. The largest officer hit him from the side with a punishing shoulder tackle, driving him violently into the solid oak of the spectator benches. The impact knocked the wind completely out of Preston's lungs with a sickening thud. He hit the polished floorboards hard, thrashing and kicking wildly in blind, pathetic panic. But the officers were utterly relentless. They pinned his arms painfully behind his back, pressing his cheek roughly against the cold floor. The sharp, unmistakable ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs engaging echoed loudly through the chamber, finalizing his absolute, inescapable ruin. The trap had not just closed, it had completely crushed them. I stood tall behind the defense table, watching my treacherous daughter weep uncontrollably on the floor, while her husband lay subdued and broken. The law I had spent my entire life defending had finally delivered its ultimate merciless judgment upon the architects of my absolute suffering. Judge Gregory Mitchell did not hesitate for a single second. The silence in the courtroom was so profound that I could hear the rain lashing against the tall glass windows, washing away the tension that had suffocated me for weeks. He looked down at the prosecuting attorney, who was still trying to subtly slide his expensive briefcase toward the center aisle, desperate to distance himself from the toxic radiation of his clients. Judge Mitchell raised his hand, pointing a stern finger directly at the bench. He announced that the emergency ex parte conservatorship was hereby entirely revoked, declared null and void from the very moment of its fraudulent inception. He stated that the court recognized me as being in complete possession of my mental faculties, my autonomy, and my legal rights. But he did not stop there. He commanded the remaining bailiffs to secure the doors and immediately issued bench warrants for the arrest of both Victoria Caldwell and Preston Caldwell. The charges he listed echoed through the chamber like a requiem: severe elder abuse, willful and premeditated fraud, forgery of financial instruments, and most damning of all, the attempted poisoning and chemical imprisonment of a vulnerable senior citizen. The judge ordered the district attorney to freeze every single asset connected to Preston and his shell venture capital firm. The trap I had laid in the dark of my psychiatric room had fully sprung, catching them completely off guard. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of chaotic, desperate motion. Additional deputies flooded through the double doors, responding to the judge and his immediate call for backup. 2 officers hauled Preston up from the polished floorboards, dragging him by his handcuffed arms as he continued to thrash and sputter incoherent pleas. His expensive charcoal suit was torn at the shoulder, covered in courtroom dust, perfectly matching the ruined state of his life. Victoria realized she was next. She tried to stand, her legs giving out beneath her, as the reality of federal prison materialized before her eyes. A female deputy approached her, instructing her to place her hands behind her back. Victoria resisted, weeping hysterically, shaking her head from side to side as the cold steel bracelets clicked tightly around her slender wrists. She turned her desperate gaze toward me, her mascara running in dark streaks down her pale cheeks. She opened her mouth to scream, but the deputies were already marching her toward the side exit, guiding her toward the holding cells. Jonathan Pierce stood beside me, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the systematic dismantling of the criminals who had tried to steal my life. We exchanged a silent nod of mutual respect. The job was not just done. It was executed with absolute terrifying perfection. I walked out of the courtroom, my posture straight, my mind sharper than it had been in decades. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind me, muting the chaotic noise of the chamber. The corridor was cold and sterile, lined with marble walls and flickering fluorescent lights. I saw the deputies escorting Victoria toward the main transport elevator. When she saw me step into the hallway, a new wave of frantic energy overtook her. She fought against the grip of the officers, using all her remaining strength to pull away from them. She threw her body forward, dropping heavily to her knees on the hard marble floor, directly in my path. The deputies tried to pull her up, but she went entirely limp, wrapping her handcuffed arms around my scuffed leather work boots. She sobbed, a loud guttural sound of sheer panic and complete defeat. "Dad, Please, she screamed, her voice echoing down the long, empty corridor. You have to stop this. You cannot let them take me away. I am your daughter. I am your blood. Please, I am begging you. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I saw the same face I had kissed when she was a child, the same eyes that had smiled at me across the dinner table for 30 years. But I also saw the monster who had slipped unprescribed antipsychotic pills into my evening tea. I saw the predator who had whispered cruel, triumphant words into my ear as I was loaded into the back of a psychiatric transport van. I felt absolutely no pity. My heart was a stone fortress completely impervious to the tears of a traitor. I did not bend down to comfort her. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that cut straight through her hysterical wails. You bled that out of yourself the day you put poison in my cup. I said, my voice steady and devoid of any human emotion. I stepped backward, pulling my scuffed boots entirely out of her grasp. I turned my back on her and walked away down the corridor, the rhythmic thud of my boots echoing against the marble. I did not look back, not even once, as her screams faded behind the heavy steel doors of the transport elevator. The justice system moved with remarkable speed when motivated by undeniable high-definition evidence and the righteous anger of a furious judge. Within 6 months, the legal proceedings concluded with devastating finality. Preston Caldwell was found guilty on multiple federal charges of wire fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy. The shadow banking syndicate he was indebted to was simultaneously dismantled by federal authorities using the forensic accounting trails Jonathan Pierce had painstakingly provided. Preston was sentenced to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He lost his firm, his reputation, and his freedom, trading his tailored suits for a uniform of standard institutional orange. Victoria faced an equally severe reckoning. The medical fraud and elder abuse charges stripped her of her pristine social standing and her accumulated wealth. She lost her license to practice any form of business management in the state. She was handed a lengthy sentence in a state correctional facility entirely isolated from the luxury and privilege she had betrayed her own father to secure. Their greed had been their absolute undoing, a poison far more potent than anything they had slipped into my drink. With my enemies behind bars, I returned to the sanctuary of my farm. I worked closely with Jonathan Pierce to successfully establish a massive bulletproof legal trust. I transferred the vast majority of my financial portfolio and the deed to the farm into this protected entity. It was specifically designed to fund legal defenses and protective services for vulnerable senior citizens who found themselves trapped in abusive conservatorships. I ensured that the exact laws I had written would never again be weaponized against the innocent. It was a crisp morning in early November. The sun was just beginning to rise over the rolling hills of the property, casting long golden shadows across the frost-covered grass. I walked out onto the wooden planks of my back porch. I held a steaming mug of black coffee in my hand. The farm was completely quiet save for the chirping of the morning birds. I stood there alone, breathing in the crisp air finally and completely at peace. Betrayal often wears the familiar face of those we trust the most, hiding greed behind a manufactured mask of false concern. We spend our lives building a legacy to protect our children, only to realize that true security does not lie in the vast wealth we accumulate, but in the strict boundaries we have the courage to enforce. Forgiveness is a virtue, but absolute accountability is a necessity. Never mistake a person's quiet patience for weakness. An old lion may rest in the shade, but his teeth remain sharp, and the truth will always burn away the shadows of deceit. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button right now. Share your thoughts in the comments. How would you have handled Victoria and Preston? Do not forget to like and turn on notifications so you never miss our next thrilling story of justice.